The rain fell in thick silver sheets as Daniel Brooks sat on the cracked steps of a downtown Detroit homeless shelter, clutching a tattered duffel bag that held everything he owned. His hoodie was soaked, his shoes had holes in them, and yet his eyes stayed fixed on the digital billboard across the street that flickered through a loop of advertisements. One of them caught his attention, a clip from a recent motivational speech by someone named Marcus A. Taylor. Four bold words hovered on the screen: "Why not you?" Daniel stared at the screen longer than he expected, the words slicing through the fog of hopelessness that had settled over him like a second skin. A bus roared past, obscuring the billboard for a moment. When it cleared, the message was gone. But the question lingered. Why not me? That night, inside the shelter, Daniel couldn't sleep. The question gnawed at him, rattled in his chest like loose change. He had once been a straight-A student, a star athlete, a kid who gave up his weekends to help his single mother scrub floors in downtown offices just to afford books. Then came the scholarship to Ohio State. Then the accident. A wrong-way drunk driver and 3 crushed vertebrae later, Daniel's football dreams ended, and so, slowly, did everything else. By the time he was 28, he had drifted between shelters and odd jobs, some lasting days, some hours. Somewhere along the way, he had forgotten how to believe in himself. But that billboard, those 4 words, they struck a different chord. Not because he hadn't heard them before. But because this time, they dared to accuse him, to remind him he had once dared to dream. The next morning, Daniel asked the shelter coordinator if there were any odd jobs around. "There's a church down on Jefferson that needs someone to clean up after a food drive," she said, handing him a bus token. "It's not much, but it's something." He took the job. Then another. Then another. Each small act gave him something to hold on to, not just the meager pay, but a rhythm, a reason to wake up. He saved every cent he could, skipped meals, and eventually scraped together enough to buy a second-hand laptop. For hours in the public library, he studied. Researched. Learned coding through free online courses. It wasn't easy. Some nights he cried quietly into his jacket sleeves, the weight of his past still heavy on his shoulders. But each time doubt crept in, he whispered the words to himself like a prayer: "Why not you?" One frigid January evening, while fixing a broken pipe beneath a community center sink for $20 and a sandwich, Daniel met someone who would change everything. Her name was Mrs. Elkins. 84, fierce as a storm, and the founder of a tiny nonprofit that taught basic tech skills to underserved youth. She squinted at Daniel as he worked, and when he stood to leave, she grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "You're too smart to be under a sink, young man." Daniel laughed nervously. "Gotta start somewhere, ma'am." She raised a brow. "Ever teach?" He hadn't. But that weekend, he found himself standing in front of 6 teenagers at the center, trying to explain how HTML tags worked. The kids laughed when he fumbled. He laughed too. But something clicked. For the first time in years, Daniel felt seen, not as a failure, not as a burden, but as someone with something to give. Weeks turned into months. He volunteered every Saturday, and then Tuesdays too. Mrs. Elkins, impressed by his dedication, introduced him to a retired engineer named Thomas Lynn who had connections in the local tech scene. "You've got something," Thomas said after reviewing Daniel's fledgling portfolio. "What you lack in polish, you make up for in passion." Soon after, Thomas arranged for Daniel to interview at a startup incubator program focused on training individuals from disadvantaged backgrounds. Daniel almost didn't show up. The night before, he had stared into the mirror, remembering all the times he'd failed. But then he whispered it again: "Why not you?" He wore the cleanest shirt he had. He borrowed a tie from Thomas. He walked into the interview trembling, but honest. He told them his story, unfiltered and raw. About the accident. The shelters. The billboard. And the fight to believe he still mattered. There was a long silence when he finished. Then one of the board members stood up, tears brimming in her eyes. "We need more Daniels," she said. He was accepted. The months that followed were brutal. 12-hour days. Endless debugging. Sleepless nights filled with caffeine and imposter syndrome. But Daniel endured. He not only finished the program, he graduated top of his class. The following year, Daniel co-founded a company called Second Spark, a platform that connected ex-convicts, displaced workers, and at-risk youth with mentors and free training in digital skills. The name came from a phrase Mrs. Elkins had once said, "Everyone deserves a second spark of hope." The platform gained traction quickly, especially among shelters and nonprofits nationwide. Word spread. Media began to cover his story. He was invited to speak at conferences. At one of them, he met Marcus A. Taylor, the same man whose words had haunted that rainy billboard years earlier. "You're Daniel Brooks?" Marcus asked, shaking his hand warmly. Daniel nodded. "You're the reason I'm here." Marcus smiled. "No. You're the reason you're here. I just asked the question. You answered it." Months later, Daniel was back in Detroit, standing on a stage at that very community center where he'd once fixed a sink for a sandwich. The same place he taught his first class. In the audience were students, city leaders, shelter coordinators, and Mrs. Elkins, now in a wheelchair, her eyes glistening with pride. He stepped up to the podium. Cleared his throat. Took a deep breath. "There were nights I didn't believe I'd make it past 30. Nights I ate from trash cans. Days I believed I'd be forgotten. But someone, somewhere, left a message I couldn't ignore. Why not